The crystal chandelier above the Tides Berry dining hall didn't just sparkle, it felt like a silent witness to a decade of my own invisibility. The light refracted through thousands of hand-cut prisms, casting jagged shadows across the faces of people who had shared a table with me for 10 years without ever truly seeing me. I stood at the edge of the long mahogany table, the weight of a heavy ceramic salad bowl pressing into my palms until my skin turned white. The smell of roasted pine nuts and expensive balsamic vinegar wafted up, but all I could taste was the metallic tang of suppressed rage. My mother-in-law, Beverly, didn't even look up from her glass of vintage Chardonnay. She was occupied with the shimmer of a guest's vintage Pate Philippa watch, her smile as sharp and artificial as the diamonds at her throat. She just waved a manicured hand toward the far end of the room, a dismissive flick of the wrist that she usually reserved for stray dogs or the gardening staff. Her voice dripped with that casual practiced cruelty she'd perfected over 30 years of social climbing. "Just leave it on the sideboard, Elena," she said, her tone smooth and cold. The room went silent. The clinking of silverware against fine china stopped midair. I could feel the eyes of 12 elite guests burning into me, some with pity, others with the bored indifference of those who consider certain people to be part of the furniture. I felt Julian's eyes on me, most of all. My husband, the man who had watched me build complex high-speed rail networks for 10 years, who knew I could manage a 1,000-man crew and a 300 million budget, yet he never found the breath to defend me. He looked at his plate, suddenly fascinated by a piece of asparagus. I didn't set the bowl on the sideboard. I didn't tremble. I walked right to the head of the table, past the silent guests, and set the bowl down directly in front of Beverly with a sharp, deliberate clack that made the wine in her glass ripple. I looked her dead in the eye, stripping away the mask of the quiet daughter-in-law I had worn, until it felt like a second skin. "You're right, Beverly. The help shouldn't eat with the guests," I said, my voice coming out steady, resonant, and like ice hitting glass. "But the owner should, and as of 40 ordered this afternoon, I own this entire resort, every stone, every bottle of wine, and the very chair you're currently sitting in. Have you ever been treated like the help by people who were supposed to be family? Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from right now. I want to hear how you handled it." I didn't wait for Beverly to respond to my reveal. I didn't need to see the wine glass slip from her hand or the way my sister-in-law Mackenzie's mouth hung open like a broken hinge. The shock in the room was a physical weight, but I was already moving. I turned and walked out of the dining hall, my heels clicking against the limestone floor with a rhythmic precision that felt like a countdown to an explosion. Most people in my position would have stayed to argue. They would have shouted, pleaded for a shred of basic respect, or waited for an apology that would never come. But I've spent a decade in systems, engineering and rail architecture. I know that you don't fix a derailment by shouting at the wreckage. You clear the tracks, isolate the fault and reroute the power. By 20:03 a.m. I was in the library. The glow of my laptop screen, the only light in the room. The darkness of the Tides Berry estate pressed against the windows. But inside the digital realm, everything was transparent. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a structural audit. For years, I had been the uncredited foundation of their version of family. I was the one who quietly fixed the plumbing emergencies they ignored. The one who paid for the legacy discounts they handed out to friends to look important, and the one who subsidized the private beach cabanas they used to host their vapid parties. They treated me like a ghost in the hallway, someone who provided comfort without requiring recognition. My fingers moved across the keys with the lethal speed of someone who knows exactly where the weak points are hidden. I accessed the Tidesbury guest management portal, the central nervous system of the resort. 6 months ago, I had used a holding company to quietly acquire the debt that was suffocating this place. While Beverly was busy gossiping about gala invitations, I was signing the papers that made me her landlord. I checked my heart rate on my watch, 72 beats per minute. Steady, clinical. Tears are just a waste of Hydration when you're executing a corporate takeover. I located the Vance family permanent resident codes. These were the keys to the kingdom. Complimentary spa access, private chef privileges, and the 100% legacy discount on the North Wing suites where they lived, for free while the resort blood money. I highlighted the entire block. One click, purged. Then I moved to the beach club database. Beverly loved the private cabana, the one where she'd once made me stand for 3 hours in the sun to hold her umbrella because she didn't want to tan, and the motor was broken. I flagged that cabana as out of service for structural integrity issues. It was a poetic truth. The integrity of this family had collapsed long ago. I was just making the paperwork match the reality. Next, I updated the Wi-Fi protocols, the biometric gate codes, and the master key card server. By the time the sun rose over the Pacific, the Vance family wouldn't just be guests who overstayed their welcome. They would be unauthorized occupants in a high-tech fortress that no longer recognized their names. Inside the library, my laptop glowed with a cold blue light, the kind of sunrise that only comes after a long night of recalibration. The Vances were officially in the red, and I was the only one holding the pen. To them, I was a mouse. That was the nickname Mackenzie had coined in a hot mic moment during last year's Christmas dinner. Unaware that the baby monitor in the kitchen was still on, I was the quiet wife with the sensible shoes and the boring job who worked somewhere in tech. They never asked for details about my work, and I never offered them. They were too busy discussing the texture of their caviar to understand that I was the lead systems architect responsible for the high-speed rail corridor that moved 3 million people a day across the coast. They lived in a world of appearances. I lived in a world of load-bearing walls and data packets. While Beverly was busy auctioning off her vintage designer bags on the side, just to keep her credit cards from being declined, I was designing digital nervous systems for $500 million infrastructure projects. I didn't spend my quarterly bonuses on diamonds or social club memberships. I didn't need a status symbol to tell me who I was. I spent that money on land. I spent it on a 400,000 acquisition fund. I've spent 11 years being the invisible pillar of this family. I was the one who paid for Mackenzie's influencer masteress in Tulum when her credit card was declined at the check-in desk, making sure she didn't look poor in front of her followers. I quietly topped off Julian's emergency fund 3 times in the last year alone, when he overspent on his classic car hobby, wanting to protect his ego from his mother's sharp tongue. I did it because I believed in the contract of marriage that you support the people you love. But I had failed to realize that they didn't love me. They loved the convenience I provided. Julian was the hardest variable to calculate in my audit. I'd watch him at these dinners, sitting there like a marble statue while his mother carved me open with her words. He wasn't a bad man in the traditional sense. He didn't hit, he didn't cheat. But he was a paralyzed one. Looking at him from across the library now, I realized he was trapped in a classic cycle of learned helplessness. Beverly hadn't just raised a son. She'd built a psychological prison around him brick by brick until he forgot there was a world outside her approval. When you're raised by a narcissist who punishes every act of independence as a betrayal, you eventually stop trying to fight. You learn that silence is the only way to avoid the scorching spotlight of their rage. Julian didn't stay quiet because he agreed with her. He stayed quiet because in his mind the predator was always bigger than the prey. He was stuck in a thick fog, fear, obligation, and guilt that made him a permanent spectator in his own marriage. He was waiting for a permission slip to be a man that Beverly would never sign. But as I sat in that library watching the server logs scroll by, I realized I couldn't inhabit his cage anymore. My compassion had been a luxury they'd overdrafted for over a decade, and the account was now empty. I'd been the silent investor in their version of family, but the dividends were non-existent, and the debt was crushing my soul. I closed the lid of my laptop. For 11 years, I'd been the ghost in their machine. The one who kept the gears greased and the lights on while staying out of the frame. But ghosts eventually stop haunting. They just move on, and when the foundation leaves, the whole structure starts to scream. The next morning, the air in the estate was thick with attention you could cut with a knife. I was in the kitchen pouring myself a black coffee when I heard the familiar rhythmic tap of Mackenzie's designer heels. She didn't come in alone. She had her phone mounted on a gimbal, the ring light reflecting in her eyes like a predatory animal. She didn't ask if I was okay after the help comment last night. She didn't even acknowledge the bombshell I had dropped. In her world, if it wasn't on her feed, it wasn't real. She pointed the camera at me while I was rinsing a mug. And here, we have the assistant in her natural habitat. Mackenzie chirped into the lens, her voice reaching that high-pitched, performative tone she used for her 300,000 followers point of view. When your brother's wife tries to claim she owns the place because she had one too many mimosas at brunch, isn't she precious? So dedicated to the aesthetic of service, she was monetizing my humiliation in real time. This was the Vance family brand extraction. They extracted my labor, my silence. And now, my dignity for digital engagement. A chime echoed from my pocket. It was the family group chat. Beverly had pinned a message at the very top for everyone to see. Regarding Elena's unfortunate outburst last night, we believe the altitude and the stress of her little project at work have caused a temporary mental episode. Please treat her with the gentle pity she deserves. Julian and I have decided to overlook her delusions for the sake of the family gala tonight. The gaslighting was masterful. In one paragraph, Beverly had transformed my factual ownership into a psychiatric symptom. She wasn't just ignoring the truth. She was rewriting reality to keep her hierarchy intact. I looked at Mackenzie through the chrome reflection of the espresso machine. She thought she was the director of this story. She thought I was just a prop in her day in the life of a socialite vlog. I took a slow sip of my coffee. The heat was grounding. Anger is a volatile fuel. It burns out too fast and leaves too much ash. I was switching to something more sustainable. Cold corporate execution. My phone buzzed again. It wasn't the group chat this time. It was an encrypted message from Ethan, the property manager I had secretly retained 3 months ago. Management files prepped. Legal team is on standby at the gate. We're ready when you are, boss. The manager's office was a sanctuary of glass and dark oak, tucked away from the sprawling, noisy opulence of the main guest wings. When I walked in, Ethan didn't stand up to give me a polite, guest-facing smile. He simply pushed a heavy leather binder across the desk toward me. The holding company is officially the sole owner, Elena. The deed was recorded and the title cleared at 40:02 p.m. yesterday. I opened the binder. The pages were a symphony of cold, hard facts. For years, Beverly had treated the North Wing as her personal boarding house, charging her socialite friends maintenance fees that never actually touched the resort's accounts. Mackenzie had been using the grand ballroom for influencer events that cost the resort while $11,000 in labor, catering, and security, all billed to an account that didn't exist, effectively stealing from the resort's operational budget. It's a parasite-host relationship. Ethan, I said, my thumb tracing the red ink on the balance sheets. I let myself imagine a counterfactual, a world where I hadn't made this move. I saw a version of myself 10 years from now, still clearing plates, still shrinking my shoulders so I wouldn't take up too much space in Beverly's peripheral vision. I saw a woman whose name had been completely erased, replaced by the title of Julian's quiet wife. If I hadn't bought this resort, I wouldn't just be losing a house. I'd be losing my soul to a family that viewed my existence as a utility. The move is total restructuring, I said, my voice sharp and clinical. I want notice to quit. Documents drafted for every single Vance family suit. No exceptions, no legacy discounts. If they can't show a paid and full receipt for the last 3 years of occupancy by tomorrow morning, they are trespassers. But the audit revealed something much darker than simple greed. Ethan slid a folder marked Vance Family Trust. Special disbursements toward me. For years, Beverly hadn't just been spending the family trust. She'd been forged her dead husband's signature to drain the tax reserves. 900,000, earmarked for property tax stabilization, had been withdrawn 6 months after he was buried. She forged it, I said. looking at the jagged, forced lines of the signature, and she was using the Tisbury's operational accounts to launder those withdrawals, disguising them as consulting fees for Shell, companies she controlled. It's tax evasion on a federal level. The Vances weren't just ungrateful, they were criminals. Julian's digital signature was on the secondary approvals. Whether he knew it or not, whether he had just mindlessly clicked approve because his mother told him to, his name was on the trail of blood and ink. They aren't just losing their rooms, Ethan, I said, closing the folder with a definitive snap. They're losing their masks. This isn't a family drama anymore. It's a criminal investigation. The gala was a sea of silk, champagne, and stolen prestige. It was the social event of the season, and Beverly stood at the center of it all, her glass raised high, bathing in the admiration of guests who didn't know they were drinking wine bought with forged checks. To heritage, Beverly proclaimed, her voice echoing off the high vated ceilings. To the Vance legacy which stands as firm as the cliffs beneath us. I didn't wait for the applause. I stepped onto the dais at the front of the room. I wasn't wearing the navy mouse dress they expected. I was wearing a custom-tailored charcoal silk suit, the kind of outfit a woman wears when she's about to sign a treaty or declare war. I had kept it hidden in my luggage for this exact second. The room fell into a confused hush. Beverly's smile didn't falter, but her eyes went cold as stones. Elena dear, you've had your little moment of drama. Sit down, before you embarrass Julian further. We're in the middle of a toast. I didn't sit. I took the microphone from W's stand. The feedback whine was sharp, cutting through the socialite chatter like a scalpel. The Vance legacy isn't standing on cliffs. Beverly, I said, my voice projected with the steady, unshakable authority of a woman who manages half-billion-dollar budgets. It's standing on 900,000 of forged signatures and 110,000 in unpaid property taxes that I just settled this morning. And unfortunately for you, the ground just gave way. I pulled a stack of documents from my portfolio, the notice to quit orders and the forensic audit summaries. I handed the top sheet to Beverly. What is this nonsense? She hissed, her face turning a sickly ashen shade of gray as her eyes scanned the bank records. That is your eviction notice, I said, making sure the microphone caught every word for the guests to hear. And those are the wire transfer records for the tax laundering you've been running through this resort's accounts. Accounts that, as of yesterday afternoon, belong to me. Julian stepped forward, his face a mask of pure panic. Elena, stop this. This is private. We can talk about this in the library. We're done talking, Julian, I said, looking at him with a pity that hurt worse than anger. You spent 10 years watching me clear the plates. Now you can watch me clear the house. I turned back to the room. The Vance family lease is terminated, effective immediately. Security is currently stationed at the North Wing suites. You have exactly 30 minutes to gather your personal items. Anything left behind, the furniture, the art, the legacy, will be seized and auctioned to offset the debt you owe this estate. Mackenzie started to scream, her phone dropping to the floor, the screen finally going dark as it hit the marble. Beverly looked at the crowd, her friends, her peers, the people she had looked down upon, and saw only the reflected horror of her own exposure. She tried to maintain her posture, but the shadow class she had mocked for so long was now the only force keeping her from falling. 30 minutes, Beverly, I said, leaning in so only she could hear me. The help doesn't wait, and neither do I. I stepped off the dais and walked through the parting crowd. For the first time in a decade, I wasn't shrinking. I wasn't apologizing for the space I occupied. I was the architect, and I had just demolished a house of cards to build something real. The tide's barrier is quiet now. The constant buzzing noise of the Vance family's demands has been replaced by the sound of the ocean. Julian is gone. He went with his mother, still unable to break the tether, even as it dragged him into a legal nightmare. The North Wing is currently being renovated. I'm turning it into a creative residency and a hub for young architects and engineers, people who actually build things instead of just consuming them. I sat on the cliffside this morning with a coffee, the wind whipping off the Pacific. I opened my old Vance family spreadsheet on my laptop. I looked at the names, the debts, the years of overlooked slights. I didn't feel a single sting of regret. I didn't feel the need to cry. I just felt the immense, quiet satisfaction of a complex system finally brought back into balance. My finger hovered over the trackpad. I selected the entire directory. I hit delete. If this story hit close to home, hit the subscribe button. I have more stories of reclaimed power to tell. What would you do if you found out your in-laws were stealing from you? Let's discuss below.